welcome to this edition of World at War. I'm your host, Mohammed Saleh. What happens when two nuclear behemoths get caught up in an eyeball-to-eyeball confrontation? The United States, for its part, has repeatedly insisted that it will do everything that it can to help Ukraine fight off the Russians. But what is the level of American involvement? For those who have any doubts, the incident that unfolded over the Black Sea, when a Russian fighter jet downed a deadly American drone, should make things crystal clear. The MQ-9 Reaper drone is no ordinary drone. It comes with a history. The Americans claim that the MQ-9 Reaper was in the Black Sea only for the purpose of surveillance. But the fact remains that over the course of the last decade, the United States has used the MQ-9 drone, which can be fitted with Hellfire missiles, to carry out high-profile attacks around the world. So what was this combat drone doing so close to the battle lines? And another question that has also been raised is this: what happens if Kiev begins to lose the war? What is America's plan B for the Ukrainians to fight against the Russians? The images of the MQ-9 Reaper drone being doused with fuel by a Russian fighter jet before it was brought down in the Black Sea have sent shivers down the spine. This is the moment where the United States and Russia engaged in direct combat with each other since the war broke out in Ukraine. The United States claims the MQ-9 Reaper drone was not on a combat mission. The Pentagon insists that the MQ-9 Reaper was flying over the Black Sea only for the purpose of surveillance. But the fact is, for more than a decade, the MQ-9 Reaper, which is fitted with deadly Hellfire missiles, has been used in combat missions around the world. Consider this: on the 3rd of January in 2020, the United States used the MQ-9 Reaper to assassinate the top Iranian military general Qasem Soleimani in Baghdad. In 2018, the MQ-9 Reaper drone was flown for a total of 325,000 hours by the US Air Force, 91% of which was for combat operations. So what the Americans can't seem to provide a convincing explanation for is this: why was a drone with this track record flying so close to the battle lines in Ukraine?
As far as an active war goes, I'm not going to go there. Incidents happen, and clearly we do not seek armed conflict with Russia, and I believe that at this point we should investigate this incident and move on from there. But we will continue to exercise our rights in international airspace.
America is categorical in one thing. It says that it does not want a war with Russia. But not all wars are started intentionally. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh has made a pretty grim assessment. After having accused the United States of carrying out the blast to sabotage the Nord Stream pipelines, he's made an explosive prediction by posing a simple question: what happens if the Ukrainian defenses begin to crumble against the Russian onslaught? What is America's plan B for the Ukraine war?
See you soon, and we'll follow up the meeting and we'll talk about it.
According to Seymour Hersh, based on his sources within the Biden administration, he says that the United States will get directly involved in the Ukraine war to fight the Russians. America's plan B is not official, but any move by the Americans to get directly involved would mean that the world will directly plunge headfirst into the Third World War. Escalating the tensions further, on the 17th of March, the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant accusing Vladimir Putin of war crimes in Ukraine.
The International Criminal Court has issued 2 warrants of arrest in the Ukraine situation. For Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation, and for Maria Lvova-Belova, Commissioner of the Russian President for Children's Rights, for the alleged war crimes of deportation of children from Ukrainian occupied territories into the Russian Federation.
Moscow has dismissed the arrest warrant against Putin as void. Russia is not a party to the ICC. The window for negotiations between the West and Russia seems to have been shut firmly. But Beijing, though, has proposed a 12-point peace plan to end the conflict in Ukraine. So as Putin and Xi Jinping meet in Moscow this week, the world will watch with bated breath on whether China can play the role of a peacemaker. Two young children who are said to be no older than 4 and 5 years old were killed in an operation by the Pakistani forces in South Waziristan. Now, Waziristan, remember, is a hotbed of radicalism in Pakistan. It is here that the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan has established its base. The Pakistani Taliban has declared an all-out war against the Pakistani state and has carried out one attack after another. To counter this violence, Islamabad has waged counter-insurgency operations in Waziristan. But the killing of two young children, who have been described as martyrs during the gunfight with the terrorists, will not help Islamabad to win the goodwill of the people in Waziristan. And our next report gets you more details.
On the 15th of March, the Pakistani forces carried out a drone strike. In the Sanghara region of South Waziristan, the objective was to target a militant hideout near the Afghan border. A total of 8 militants were killed. 2 Pakistani soldiers were injured, but tragically, 2 young children were also killed. This is Pakistani military's first drone strike in over 5 years. The last time the Pakistani military had carried out a drone strike within its own borders was in 2018. But what is shocking is the manner in which the Pakistani military has tried to wash its hands of the tragedy. To begin with, the Pakistani military denied there was a drone strike. It insists there was only a gunfight between the Pakistani security forces and the terrorists, terming the incident of 2 young children aged 4 and 5 who were killed in the attack as most unfortunate. The Pakistani military has described the 2 killed children as martyrs. But the people in South Waziristan dispute the sequence of events. They insist it was a drone strike that killed the young children and have some military shrapnel to show for their claims. Waziristan has bitter memories of drone strikes. For over 2 decades, the United States, as part of its war on terror, had repeatedly used drones to bomb regions in Pakistan and Afghanistan to smoke out terrorists. An estimated 3,000 people are said to have died between the years of 2003 till 2016. But often, many innocent civilians also died as collateral damage. Ever since the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan declared an all-out war against the Pakistani state in November of 2022, there has been one terror attack after another targeting the security forces in the country. In response, Islamabad has stepped up its anti-insurgency measures. But the tragic deaths of young children as collateral in Waziristan will only stoke the embers of violence that have singed Pakistan for over 2 decades.
Is the state of Israel heading towards a civil war? Has Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's longest-serving prime minister, pushed the Israeli state to the edge of an abyss? Because you see, with his judicial changes that Netanyahu is trying to sell in the name of reforms, what the Israeli prime minister is trying to do is to break the back of the Israeli judiciary. What Netanyahu wants to do is to make the Israeli judiciary subservient to his executive. And the Israeli people are not willing to let the prime minister get away with this. This is part of the biggest protests that have been witnessed in the state of Israel since it came into existence. They've literally paralyzed the country. Imagine a situation where a sitting prime minister is not even allowed to go to the airport, because this is what is presently unfolding on the streets of Israel.
Israeli protesters returned to the streets of Tel Aviv on Thursday evening in continuation of the protests against the proposed judicial reforms that have rocked the Middle Eastern nation for 11 straight weeks now. On a day dubbed as the Day of Resistance, demonstrators blocked roads and clashed with Israeli police. Demonstrations were also reported in Jerusalem and the northern city of Haifa. Earlier in the day, Jerusalem woke up to the sight of a long red line painted by Israeli protesters along roads leading to Israel's Supreme Court. Israeli police later arrested the 5 Israelis who had disguised themselves as workers to carry out the protest action. The Thursday protests were prompted by the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's rejection of a compromise deal proposed by the President Isaac Herzog a day earlier. While outlining the compromise plan, the President issued a dire warning.
Whoever thinks that a true civil war where human life is at stake is a border we won't reach has no clue. Specifically now, in the 75th year of the State of Israel, the abyss is at arm's reach. A civil war is a red line. I won't let that happen, at any cost and in every way.
The anger of the Israeli people can be gauged by the fact that on Wednesday, hundreds of Israeli protesters had gathered outside Netanyahu's residence in Palestine to try and prevent him from reaching the airport. Also, they disrupted traffic outside the Ben Gurion airport ahead of Netanyahu's flight to Germany. Ever since Netanyahu's hard-right government announced the reforms in January, the month after assuming office, Israel has been rocked by regular, massive protests. The proposed judicial reforms, several provisions of which have already been adopted by the parliament, have been described as the end of democracy.
I'm here to demonstrate and to sound my voice against the dictatorship that they are established here in the name of the so-called law, judicial reform. It's not a judicial reform, it's a revolution that's making Israel go to full dictatorship. And I want Israel to stay a democracy for my kids, for my grandson that will be here, because Israel is a democracy country and it must stay as one.
The judicial overhaul, if enacted, would allow lawmakers to scrap Supreme Court rulings with a simple majority vote. Not only will it limit Supreme Court powers, but simultaneously invest the executive with more power in selection of judges. A move that has caused alarm domestically as well as internationally about the country's checks and balances. In addition to this, opponents have accused Netanyahu, who faces a string of corruption allegations, of trying to use the reforms to quash possible judgments against him. Netanyahu is of the opinion that the Supreme Court too often overreaches and intervenes in political matters it has no mandate to rule on, whereas the defenders of the court staunchly believe that it is the bastion of democracy in charge of protecting rights and liberties. Whether these protests, biggest in the 75-year history of Israel, compel Benjamin Netanyahu to roll back the reforms or gradually dissipate to usher in a new era of dictatorship in Israel, only time will tell.
The Allied Democratic Forces are an Islamist rebel group. Originally based out of western Uganda, they've now spread their tentacles deep into the Democratic Republic of Congo. On the 8th of March, the ADF carried out an attack in the village of Mukondi, in which about 40 people were killed. The attackers reportedly wore military fatigues. The villagers initially welcomed them, mistaking these attackers to be soldiers. But then the killing started. So what is this rebel group, and what does it seek to achieve in the already troubled region of the Eastern Democratic Republic of Congo, where the M23 rebels have been on a rampage for the last several years?
More than 40 villagers were hacked to death by extremists in conflict-riddled eastern Congo. The Allied Democratic Forces, or ADF, a rebel militia, struck Mukandi and a neighboring village Moussa late night on 8th of March. The Islamist militant group torched dozens of buildings, hacked more than 40 to death, besides wounding at least 17, including 11 children. Unsuspecting villagers were caught off guard in the middle of International Women's Day celebrations.
People were killed here, houses were burned, they were killed with machetes and set on fire, but there was no crackling of bullets. In fact, 31 men were killed in Mukandi, and in a village near us, about 2 kilometers away, 8 people were killed.
Allegedly, military forces arrived too late to have any chance of protecting the villagers. For decades, Eastern Congo has been battling more than 120 armed groups who fight for power, influence and natural resources. ADF is among the deadliest, accused of slaughtering thousands of civilians. They pledged allegiance to Islamic State in 2019. Though largely active in the northern Kivu province, it recently has extended its operations into neighboring Ituri province and even areas near the regional capital, Goma. Their expanding footprint can be attributed to a lack of considerable Congolese army presence in the region.
Here 3 or 4 days do not go by without us recording deaths, the result of barbarity, the ADF terrorists. That is why once again we repeat, we need a considerable military force to come that can contribute to the restoration of peace.
Confirming the worst fears, ADF conducted another deadly raid barely 3 days later in the village of Kirandera, killing at least 19. A medical facility was also torched in the early morning raid. ADF rebels have been accused by United Nations and other rights groups of targeting, maiming, raping and abducting civilians, including children. Such has been their menace that United States earlier this month announced a reward of $5 million for information leading to the capture of the group's leader, Seka Musa Baluku. The sheer scale of bloodshed and violence has driven over 5.5 million from their homes, triggering the largest internal displacement crisis in Africa. The persistence and ominous evolution of ADF in Congo's east poses a rather difficult challenge for the Congolese government, especially at a time when the M23 rebels have been on an offensive as well.
In one of our earlier episodes, we had told you about how El Salvador has built the biggest prison in Latin America. And now, El Salvador is filling this prison with members of criminal gangs that it has arrested. An estimated 100,000 people in El Salvador are already behind bars. For context, this is about 2% of the total El Salvadoran population. Now, human rights groups have alleged that besides criminals, even common citizens have borne the brunt of El Salvador's iron fist policy. But the 41-year-old El Salvadoran president, Nayib Bukele, has rubbished these allegations. The president claims that his policies are meant to fight organized crime in his country. But how far has this iron fist policy for tackling criminal gang violence succeeded in El Salvador?
The El Salvadoran parliament has again extended the emergency measures to crack down on some of the most deadly criminal gangs in the world. From the 1980s, the Barrio 18 and the MS-13, the most dreaded criminal gangs, have dominated the streets of El Salvador. But for more than a year now, the 41-year-old El Salvadoran president, Nayib Bukele, has waged a ruthless operation to lock up every single criminal gang member in his country. To this end, Nayib Bukele has constructed the biggest prison facility in Latin America, with the capacity to hold 40,000 prisoners. The terrorism confinement center is built on an expansive 23-hectare complex. Prisoners have no contact with the outside world, and they are escorted out only to appear for a hearing in the court. With 7 guard towers, the possibility of a jailbreak is almost impossible. And this brand new prison is now being filled up with those who have been arrested.
We ask that this regime be extended for longer. We need to continue fighting criminal structures. We need to provide a better service to Salvadoran families and guarantee the life and property of the Salvadoran family.
In 2015, El Salvador surpassed Honduras as the most violent country in the world, with a murder rate of more than 100 for every 100,000 inhabitants. But ever since the state of exception was imposed in March 2022, after a spate of murders by the criminal gangs, the police and the army have gone on an overdrive, rounding up suspected gang members and their collaborators. But many constitutional rights have been suspended. Arrests have been made without warrants, resulting in El Salvador having the highest incarceration rate in the world. But President Nayib Bukele insists that things have improved.
There was a murder rate here of 73 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. The murder rate in 2022 was just 3 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants. Last year, the murder rate in Soyapango was similar to the murder rate in Canada. Youth in Soyapango now have the freedom to be what they want to be. They are free to be artists or athletes, to go to school or get a job, to play and have fun, to go out and live in their community, to go to the sports fields and into public spaces. And now also to come here, to this cubo that has books, PlayStations, computers, and internet.
At the moment, Nayib Bukele seems to have the solid backing of his people, with an 86% approval rating, making him the most popular leader in Latin America. But questions have been raised about human rights violations. But the mano dura, or the iron fist anti-criminal gang policy, has been slammed by Human Rights Watch. Activists say the policy has been used as a license to arrest people from some of the most vulnerable sections of the society. Human Rights Watch has also raised some inconvenient questions about enforced disappearances, torture, ill-treatment of detainees, and custodial deaths. But Nayib Bukele's government has rubbished these allegations, citing a downward trend in the exodus of people who were fleeing the endemic violence. Nayib Bukele's government insists that the only way to make people feel safe in El Salvador is by keeping the criminals behind bars.
Thanks for watching World at War. And if you want to reach out to me with any comments, feedback or suggestions, you can do so by tweeting to me on the Twitter handle that you see on your screens. I'm your host Mohammed Saleh, and I'll meet you again next week. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.